this next topic is the Endangered Species Act. So we'll talk about a little bit more than just the ESA or Endangered Species Act through this, but that's the biggest focus. But it's more broadly about habitat, environmental wildlife habitat, and species protection. So the first and big one is the Endangered Species Act of 1973. The ESA is designed to protect critically imperiled species from extinction as a consequence of economic growth and development untendered by adequate concern and conservation. So we don't want to keep growing houses, condominiums, and strip malls and roadways to the point where we start killing off wildlife. That's the intent of this act, to recognize and protect. But it's not just the species, it's also the ecosystems upon which they depend. And in particular, the ecosystems are those habitats, the other organisms, their food source, their nesting grounds, et cetera, et cetera. There really is a community in nature that is required to support these endangered species. The Endangered Species Act, it's a federal act and it encompasses plants and invertebrates as well as vertebrates. So plants, all kinds of plants from annuals and herbaceous plants. Invertebrates, that would be things like earthworms even would fall in that category. Insects could fall into that category. And then the vertebrates, things with a backbone, vertebrae. So that would be the mammals like us, fish, birds, reptiles, and amphibians, frogs, lizards, things of that, or frogs, salamanders, not lizards, frogs, salamanders. Anyway, so it pretty much covers potentially all categories of organisms. In practice, things that are cute and have big eyes, we protect a lot more than things that slither and slime. So there's an important word you need to know, take. It is used in the ESA, not only in the law, but also in the rules surrounding compliance or the regulations of the ESA. It protects listed species against take, which is a very broad sense. Take in some contexts, in some usage, it's only about killing, hunting, trapping, but it's more than that. Any type of activity that will harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, or collect, or to attempt to engage in any such conduct, all of that is considered take. And so there have been a lot of arguments between business interests and environmental interests in terms of how to define take. Is the road noise and the lights, the headlights of a highway going through an area, is that enough to consider it take because you're harassing through the light pollution and noise pollution in a very sensitive organism's environment? In some cases, yeah. In other cases, no. It hasn't been seen that way. So there are two main federal organizations that handle or administer the ESA, and that is the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, the FWS, and NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. And there's a little bit of boundaries in our estuaries and coastal regions, but it's pretty clear the forests and prairies and timberland, rangeland, that's under Fish and Wildlife Service. And NOAA handles our oceans. ESA only protects species. So yes, it does talk about habitats, but it only is going to protect those species that fall in the categories of either endangered or threatened. And so there are rules for how do you list a species. Endangered means they're at high risk of going extinct. Threatened means they're at high risk of becoming endangered. So it's one step down the risk scale. When you're threatened, it's just like you're on a close watch list, but you're still protected as threatened. Maximum penalties, fines up to $50,000, imprisonment for up to a year, and civil penalties up to $25,000 per violation. And they can be stacked, so what might be argued as a single event could be seen as multiple events. It can get pretty pricey. There are exceptions. Persons acting to protect him or herself or any other individual from bodily harm from an endangered species or threatened species. So if there is an endangered grizzly bear trying to eat your spouse, you're allowed to use lethal means in order to protect your family. No criminal penalties for accidentally killing listed species during farming and ranching activities. So if you are out there intentionally wiping out some population because they're interfering with your farming, that's not okay. But if some endangered frog gets caught up in your listing machine, that's not a violation. No, Tom, not the blue ones. They're endangered. Anyway, so there has to be a recovery plan. If you list a species, you have to list it with a recovery plan. You have to have some idea. All right, there's a species that we can identify that is at risk, threatened or endangered. What are we going to do about it? And that's the recovery plan. The recovery plan has to have certain goals, things you're going to do, tasks, has to have some costs, economic as well as task related costs, so direct and indirect costs, plus some estimated timeline. And this is your best guess, obviously, as a researcher into species and habitat, and you update these with regularity. So these are moving targets. Now, there has to be critical habitat designated within this plan. So you can't just say anywhere that we know this endangered frog has lived, is living, or might one day live, we're going to protect it all. You have to say what is the critical habitat, the habitat that is essential to the survival of the species. So it took a few years for critical habitat to be defined in the law, but that's really, really common to have a new law and then you try to implement the law, you find out that there's holes in the law, it doesn't work the way it sounded when you were at a conference room table. Out in the real world, there's problems. And for the ESA, one of these problems was the lack of a definition of habitat. And so they defined this critical habitat area as being defined as part of the listing process in order to help develop an appropriate recovery plan. So for all threatened and endangered species, cost is an issue only in designation of critical habitat. That's hugely important. Remember this, cost is an issue only in designation of critical habitat. So when you're trying to figure out how we're going to figure this critical habitat, and you've got some species that has, 200,000 acres of potential habitat, and 500 of those 200,000 acres happen to be a major port or something, shipping port, you might not put that in the critical habitat because it would be too expensive to shut down the Port of Oakland to protect this species. You can do it other ways, other areas, find more appropriate, less economically damaging critical habitat. So cost is only an issue in designating critical habitat. Cost cannot be considered when the decision is being made to list an animal as threatened or endangered. That's the key. So once a biologist has made the case to say, I've identified this particular species as threatened or endangered, cost it is not a consideration. It is illegal to determine whether a species is threatened or endangered using cost. Cost is zero in the first step of listing them as threatened or endangered. Once they're listed with cost out of the picture, now cost comes in. Now you have to think, all right, we need a plan. What are we going to do about it? Now, in terms of designating critical habitat and developing that plan, cost is an issue. Okay? But you can't just say, it's too expensive to list that species. That would be illegal. Critical habitat shall not include the entire geographical area which can be occupied by the species. I already mentioned that. It must be some subset of its habitat. Designation takes into consideration economic impact, impact on national security, and any other relevant impact. So again, listing the species as threatened or endangered cannot by law consider cost in any way, shape, or form. Once it is listed, now you must consider cost in terms of developing a plan, in terms of designating critical habitat. Nexus, when things come together, the federal agencies are prohibited from authorizing, funding, or carrying out actions that destroy or adversely modify critical habitats. So federal government cannot do anything through its issuance of permits, sales, contracts, whatever it does. The government cannot in any way do anything that would destroy or adversely modify critical habitats. The federal nexus, or the connection to any federal permit, funding, or agency, brings most private land within the reach of ESA regulation, including critical habitat restrictions. So if you're a farmer, are you having to follow federal laws and regulations and get permits? And yeah, there's almost nothing anybody does that doesn't somehow have a connection to government in some way, shape, or form that would put the property under the scope of the ESA, at least under the authority for the federal government to come in and say, we have the ability to enforce the ESA on this private land. And in most cases, they can. Habitat Conservation Plan. This was added in 1982, so it's been around for quite a while. It goes beyond the critical habitat, and it takes into account some other issues that were recognized over the past 9 years of attempting to implement the ESA. And these habitat conservation plans are looking at the habitat for the species and how to use the habitat conservation plan to help with the species. It also allows what are called incidental take permits. Initially, it's like, well, you cannot kill or take, harass, harm, any of those words take. You can't do any of that, right? If it's an endangered or threatened species. There's no take allowed whatsoever. it was recognized that, yeah, sometimes you do need to get in there and do some work. You need to do some research. You need to study these animals. You need to possibly literally shoot some animals that are overpopulating a particular area that might do more harm than good. You can have a population crash if you let the population get too big in a small area and they run out of food and the whole population crashes. So all this wonderful work to build up this species in a small area goes out the window. And they started to recognize that our narrow-minded, looking at this problem through a straw, wasn't working. We need a conservation plan that includes these kinds of thinking, that we can sometimes allow incidental take, where we have to do something that might harass, harm, or even kill or trap some of these endangered animals. We have to be able to manage them. We have to be able to do science. We have to be able to build facilities in an area, whatever it is. The Habitat Conservation Plan provides mitigation. So there's fees charged to landowners. Land is contributed as permanent habitat, something a lot of people might do. They'll leave land as a permanent critical habitat. Lots of that done in the Santa Cruz Mountains throughout the Central Coast here. Acquisition of habitat land by the government. And so there are conservation agencies like the Sempervirens Fund. Sempervirens is the giant coastal redwoods. The Sequoia sempervirens is the species of our giant coastal redwoods we have here. And so the Sempervirens Funds is focused on primarily from Central California up into Washington State, getting land. There's many different other organizations that focus on privately holding these permanently donated habitats in some sort of land trust of some sort. And we'll get into those at another time. But the government also has programs through national parks and national forests, national recreation areas, Bureau of Land Management, plus those are all federal, plus there's the state types of land as well. And so California has its own land conservation programs. Habitat Conservation Plan, incidental take permits. Take is defined by the ESA. Already you've seen this: harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, or collect any threatened or endangered species. So you can get permits if you need to do something. And the permits would be on a case-by-case basis. In some cases, it is the killing of or trapping of an endangered or threatened species. In other cases, it's for other purposes. Local governments can create a habitat conservation plan. So it can be right here in Monterey County. I know many counties have their hands in habitat conservation plans for the local regions. And they collaborate not only upwards to the state level, but at the federal level as well. Let's take a short break.